Thank you so much for joining us this afternoon for our webinar on Beyond the Census. Now that we are approaching the end of the self-response phase, as well as the end of the 2020 census, we really wanted to talk to our community of census stakeholders about what this effort that we all have been participating in for the last year and a half or year or so means for our future of our city and our future work. Today, we really wanted to highlight the ways in which the census will affect New York City's economic recovery, which is so important, redistricting, upcoming local and state federal elections, and how we can build upon this year's outreach, census outreach, to support our continued advocacy efforts. And to do that, we have some phenomenal speakers, including our keynote, who is James Patchett. He's the president of the New York City Economic Development Corporation. And then we have a panel discussion with three very informed and knowledgeable panelists who I've had opportunity to work with over these last 2 years. Laree Daniel Favors, who's the interim executive director for the Center for Law and Social Justice at Medgar Evers College. We have Beth Link, who's director of Census Counts campaign at the Leadership Conference on Civil and Human Rights. And we have Jeff Weiss from New York Law School. You know, now that we are in the last stretch, we want everyone to know that it's not too late, right? So the end of the self-response rate period will be September 30th, but we still have time to get New Yorkers counted. And when many of us began this journey of the 2020 census over 2 years ago, we anticipated some obstacles along the way, right? Even the constant suppression efforts of the federal government. However, we could not have imagined the global pandemic that would make New York City the epicenter of its devastation. You know, many of our census partners planned really innovative and creative ways to reach our communities, especially the communities that have been historically undercounted, and many of those tactics became unusable. And in the New York spirit, in the way that we do things, we bounced right back with really cool and creative ways and pivoted our strategies because the stakes are way too high. And when we look at the numbers, right, we look at the national self-response to date, right? 65.5% of the nation have self-responded to the census. In New York State, it's 62%. And then when we look at New York City, which has an average of 58.9%, we have some areas and some census tracts that are doing better than others. If we look by borough, Staten Island is leading, and it's been leading since the beginning at a 63.9% response rate. Unfortunately, Brooklyn is trailing all 5 counties at 55.9. But as we work together to increase our numbers, again, we want everyone to know that it's not too late, and we need to do all that we can to get every New Yorker counted. And however, this is the time for us to be seen, to be heard, and to be counted because our future depends on it. In this time, we have the opportunity to build power and accountability and get the resources that will help New York City recover. Recent events have once again uncovered the inequalities in our society. However, there is opportunity in it all. We have a role to play in making this change, and we can start with the census and continue with a strong economic recovery plan based on investments in our people, in our communities, and in our businesses. And we can do this in an inclusive and participatory way. And this is what our partners in the census world do each and every day, right? While they deliver their services to the communities that they service on a regular basis. We are here to talk about what happens after the census count, which is about our past, it's about our present, and it's about our future. These numbers depend on so much. We hold the power to reverse the trend of being under-resourced and being undercounted, and to ensure that our communities get the money, power, and respect that we deserve. And I am delighted to introduce our keynote speaker today, James Patchett. You know, I've had the pleasure of working with James closely over the years, and I can honestly say he gets it. Sitting on the board of EDC and participating in strategic planning sessions for the corporation, I've seen EDC transition from a place-based model of practice to investment in people. working into every project workforce development goals that meet the needs of the affected neighborhoods, to exceeding MWBE requirements and revamping the way EDC encourages participation of local women, minority, and disadvantaged businesses, to working with other agencies to ensure that there are resources for capital improvement and infrastructure when we plan development in communities. James Patchett is the president and CEO of the New York City Economic Development Corporation. And in his role, he draws on his experience from real estate, finance, government, and urban planning, exactly what we need in this moment in time. And he oversees some of the city's most ambitious projects. Some of these projects during his tenure include launching the citywide NYC ferry, strengthening New York City's competitive position as a hub for growing industries, including cybersecurity and life sciences. And he continues to revision New York City Economic Development Corporation's 60 million square feet of real estate so that it is a place where all communities can take advantage of the development of our growing city. Prior to him running EDC, he served as Chief of Staff for former Deputy Mayor for Housing and Economic Development, Elisa Glenn, where he helped oversee more than 25 city agencies and played a pivotal role in preserving thousands of affordable homes. With that, I'd like to introduce James Patchett, who will talk about exactly what does the census mean for the economic recovery of our great city of New York. With that, James.
Thanks, Malva. What a nice introduction, gosh. It makes me feel like I may have paid you to say those nice things, which I did not. I did want to just say good afternoon, everyone, and what a pleasure it is to be with all of you today. Obviously, there's nothing more important than the census right now, and Melva and ABNY's leadership on this point have been incredibly valuable to the city over the last few months. What an honor and totally deserved to have appointed Melva as the CEO of ABNY in recognition not only of her work on the census, but the incredible work she's done across New York City and communities for so many years. It has been a real pleasure to have Melva serve on our board, and I'm honored to be here today. There's no one I'd be happier to be introduced by. So thank you for everything you guys are doing on the census, but also as part of our efforts to continue to ensure that New York City really is the fantastic place that it has been, and that we successfully address some of the issues where we have work to do. I had an opportunity this morning to join Melva ringing the bell of the New York Stock Exchange, which was pretty fun. Turns out it requires pushing a button for 10 seconds and an hour and 29 minutes of sitting around, but it was a real pleasure to be with her there. And so we were there to talk about the All In NYC effort, which is a campaign to really talk about the spirit of New Yorkers, the incredible pride that we all have in our city. Had these great masks, All In NYC. So I encourage people to get all in on their city. I know all the people on this call really believe in their city. So go out there, show your pride for your city. There's a lot of people out there who are saying that New York City is not the fabulous city that it is. And while we have our challenges, those of us who live here and walk around here every day know all of our strengths, and this is an opportunity for us to collectively raise our voices. So, I want to talk about the census, obviously the focus of today's discussion. There's, like I said, nothing more critical to the city's economy than the census. Now more than ever, we really need the city well represented in Washington, D.C., and we need every dollar of federal investment we can get. We needed it before, but we need it now more than ever with the impacts of COVID on our city in terms of both the budget shortfalls that we're experiencing, as well as the increased spending that we're incurring to ensure that New York stays a safe place. And obviously, with the craziness of Washington, ensuring that every one of those seats that we can possibly have, we get, is critically important. I want to share a little bit of background on what my organization has been working on and why this year's census is so critical. So as Melva mentioned, I have the honor of being the president and CEO of the city's Economic Development Corporation. We were a pretty traditional economic development organization before the last 6 months. We have over 60 million square feet of real estate, as Melva mentioned, which we're constantly investing in to ensure that it maximizes job opportunities for New Yorkers. We're investing in growing industries. we're building infrastructure, we're investing in people and in our neighborhoods. But over the last 6 months, we really had to transform ourselves, like really every organization has, to address the challenges of COVID. So it sort of feels like we've become a biotech startup, a manufacturing operation, a place that can help set up hospitals and build ventilators. We turned our cruise terminals into hospitals and our armories into food distribution centers. We took our local supply chains and set them up from scratch, and we produced critical medical supplies. I think what's critical is that this didn't just happen at once. This happened as a result of investments that we've been making for years in industries like manufacturing that are so pivotal to New York City's continued growth as well as our history. All of these investments came together at a pivotal moment. And that's why what we've seen across the city is New York City really standing up its own supply chain. And thanks to the efforts of New Yorkers across the board, we've really seen incredible progress on the health front. And we're talking about economic recovery. Obviously, in addition to the census, health is the critical issue. And how do we address health? With sufficient funding for testing and other critical medical supplies that we need to make sure our first responders are protected. That's why we've been able to drive the infection rate down so low. We have fewer than 1% of tests being positive in the city on a 7-day rolling average. And on top of that, we have an incredibly low infection rate in New York City. We're at approximately 22 cases per 100,000 on a 7-day average. That puts us, if we were a state, the 4th lowest overall infection rate in league with Maine, Vermont, and New Hampshire. Now, when you walk around New York City, New Yorkers are wearing masks. They're being incredibly safe. But I think the rest of the world doesn't appreciate the incredible progress we've made on the health front and the fact that it is literally as safe to walk around in New York City as it is to walk around in Vermont. It's hard to believe, but that is what the statistics show right now. So what we see from all of this is the incredible resilience of New Yorkers and the incredible resilience of our city. And increasingly, we're seeing the city continuing and coming back to life even more. More and more New Yorkers coming back to their offices, like Melva and I are right now, I believe. Outdoor dining in the city has become a new favorite pastime. And beginning September 30th, there'll be 25% indoor dining available. Have our cultural institutions reopening, many of whom are ABNY members. The Museum of Natural History just welcomed visitors for the first time yesterday. The Met opened a couple of weeks ago and had lines around the block. New Yorkers want to get out and support those local cultural institutions. We've seen local drive-in movies all around across all of our boroughs. We've seen just an incredible amount of innovation and excitement from New Yorkers. Ridership on the ferry has been coming back at significant scale. Just this Labor Day, we had the highest ridership we've had all year and getting comparable to what we've had in previous years. So overall, we're seeing real progress and growth in the city. Just last Friday, the MTA recorded about 2.6 million rides on our subways and buses. It's still way down from the peak. But to put it in context, that's about the population of Paris. So New York City, we're here to stay. And I think one of the ways that we've been so successful is by putting the science first. And we're going to continue to do that as we look forward towards the economic recovery. Now, I think what this means is that we have to continue to lean into the things that allowed us to come this far. As I mentioned, continuing to focus on supporting and growing good jobs good sectors that create good jobs like life sciences, healthcare, and manufacturing. They were essential to responding to the crisis, and they're going to be central to the growth of our city in the years to come. We've got to support the hardest hit communities. We've got to make sure that they have the economic support that they need, that there are job opportunities for people in those communities, and that as we reopen offices, theaters, and schools, we keep a close eye on the health statistics to make sure that we're not putting vulnerable New Yorkers at higher risk. And at the same time, as I mentioned, we got to remind people in New York and all around the world that New Yorkers really are all in New York City. I encourage people to go out there and use this rallying cry to remind New Yorkers and everyone else about what a fabulous city this is. With our All in NYC campaign, I'll put in a plug for it since I have all of your attention. The weeks of September 14th and the 21st, we're doing our Blitz Weeks, which means we have activations all over the city New Yorkers just out there expressing their pride in New York. I hope that each of you and your organizations will take the opportunity to talk about the work that you're doing in communities and about how committed you are to making sure this city stays strong and gets stronger. In all of this effort, we have to make sure that we keep equity and inclusion at the center of the recovery. We have to not just build back to what normal was in New York City before, we have to build to a new and better normal. This is an opportunity to really reflect on that and make sure we're even more inclusive city for everyone who comes here, to build more affordable housing, to make sure that we don't allow the disparate underlying health conditions of New Yorkers to go unaddressed. So it's incredible how much progress we've made in New York City. But as we look to recover, we really are going to need the support of the federal government, which has simply not stepped up to date to provide the necessary financial relief that New York City needs. Last spring, New York City we made the hard decisions, and some other places around the country didn't make all those hard decisions. We shut down a lot of businesses, and that obviously produced a lot of economic pain. But it's what has allowed us to have the success we've had on the health indicators. But with those shutdowns, we lost a lot of tax revenue. Sales tax from people going out and spending money, income taxes because we have a lot of people who are unemployed, user fees on all kinds of things are way down, in addition to the significant financial consequences that the MTA is experiencing. All of those are reasons why it's critically important that there be support from the federal government for places like New York. The city is facing a $9 billion revenue hit across fiscal year 20 and 21. That's more than 3 times the impact of the 08 and 09 recession. And that's in addition to spending what's expected to be over $3 billion by this end of the calendar year on COVID response. So what does that mean? It means we need immediate aid from the federal government now, but it's why filling out this year's census is more important than ever. This isn't just going to impact what funding we receive over the next 6 to 12 months. It's going to impact the funding we receive over the next 10 years. We need every single representative we can have down in Washington, D.C., fighting for the right decisions to be made, decisions that support cities, and for the economic and social supports that cities like New York need to be able to succeed. I think the amount of unemployment that we've experienced in the city just underscores how critically important it is that New Yorkers continue to have support from the federal government. Federal funding for programs, certainly like unemployment, but all of the things we've gotten used to, Head Start programs, public transportation, highways, affordable housing, supports for seniors, investments in infrastructure, job creation, all of the things that are necessary at all times, but especially when we're in economic downturn, especially when we have a health crisis like the one that we're facing. It's hard to believe that people in DC are turning their backs on places like New York and cities all over the country right now. And that's why the hard work of our census outreach workers is so critical. We're so grateful for all the work that they're doing, whether they're sending text messages or out there knocking on doors, the long hours everyone is putting in. They've been all over the city. And we know that, as Melva said, we're not where we need to be. The national response rate is close to 65%, and we're under 60% in New York City. I know the response rates are particularly low in congressional districts 10, 12, and 15, which happen to overlay with some of the neighborhoods that were hardest hit by COVID. We understand that it's hard to want to go out and answer the door when your community has been so impacted by COVID. But at the same time, it's all that much more critical that those communities make sure that they have the representation that they need in Congress, that they get their voices heard in DC about the challenges that they've faced through this time, and frankly, for many years that have gone unaddressed by DC. So, I think we have to say there's nothing more important than using everything at your disposal to ensure that people fill out the census. I had a neighbor of mine in Brooklyn or a former neighbor of mine who moved to a different neighborhood in May. And the census workers kept coming by, knocking on his door. And finally I went over there and I said, the person who lived here in April, he moved. And they said, well, we need him to fill out his form. So I sent him a text message. I said, buddy, it's your civic duty. Fill out your census form. And he did it. You know, it's these small things, everything that all of us can do, whether it's in our personal capacities and our professional capacities, using our social media, all of these things are the way that we can make sure the census is successful as it needs to be, and how we're going to continue to make sure that we're creating a better New York. Thanks, Mel.
Thank you. And I know you have to run. I know you have a meeting at 1:30, but I just wanted to just ask you one follow-up question, because you made a really good connection between sort of the work EDC has been doing in terms of supply chain around health, the recovery of a healthy New York. But so much of the census is also about the data and the numbers, and businesses use that data to make decisions and to grow. There's also, like you said, there are programs that are directly funded from census formulation that support small businesses. And, you know, as we need to get our city back on track, we also need to get our residents back to work, right? So we need to make sure that our small businesses are strong and are able to weather the storm as well as reopen. And I know that EDC has also been very instrumental in sort of helping sort of SBS and other agencies that support small businesses. So if you could just talk a little bit about that before you jump, that would be great.
Of course, yeah. Well, I mean, I guess I would completely underscore the importance of this data. I mean, the census is the richest data opportunity that we have in the decade, right? So we're all trying to understand exactly what's going on the ground. There is no better way than doing a count of literally every household in New York City to understand exactly what's going on. These data sources are so rich, and they're incredibly useful for community planning, for thinking about, you know, what currently exists in neighborhoods and what is missing in neighborhoods. This is the kind of data that we just can't afford to miss. Having this information is a critical resource to us, not just now, but for the next decade. Obviously, it's supplemented with a variety of surveys that happen over the decade, but there's nothing like the decennial census for data. You know, as you said, I mean, there's countless ways that the census supports, or sorry, the census which supports funding ultimately supports efforts in the city. A great example of that, in addition to the small businesses, is workforce development funding. Funding to ensure that we have training programs for New Yorkers who are unemployed or who are looking to just get into a new career so that they can raise their incomes. You know, those types of programs are even more critical today than they were a year ago or 6 months ago. And so being sure that we have sufficient access to funding for workforce development is another critical reason why it's important to support the census. But small businesses, yeah, I mean, it's painful to see what's happening out there with so many businesses. You know, we know New Yorkers are resilient and we believe in it and we're all in, but at the same time, a lot of people who have spent years and years building their businesses and are now struggling to make ends meet. You know, when they're shut down for a long period of time, their customers are not coming back at the scale they're used to. And so, you know, whether it's funding that comes through the Small Business Administration, through, you know, the regular grant and loan programs that they have, or even the PPP that's been distributed during the pandemic, all of those sources of funding are critically important, and small businesses are the most important economic backbone we have in the city. So support for them is critical.
Thank you. Thank you for that. And again, thank you for all the work that you do on a daily basis, but particularly during sort of this very difficult time. EDC really stepped up. And I'm not just saying that because I'm on the board, but EDC really stepped up. And again, thank you, James.
Thank you. Thank you for your leadership.
My pleasure. So now we are going to introduce our panel who will talk a little bit about sort of what this census process means to their normal service delivery. You know, we heard from James Patchett, who talked about sort of how EDC has stepped up and what the census means to not only their core service, but also sort of what the census means to the city of New York as we try to rebuild. But now I really want to introduce a very stellar panel that I have had the opportunity of working with for the last 2 years. When I was a newbie in this census space, these three individuals really schooled me. And first, I'd like to introduce Beth Link. She is the director of the Census Counts campaign at the Leadership Conference on Civil and Human Rights and the Leadership Conference Educational Fund. This is a national organization. In this role, she's responsible for leading the campaign to ensure that 2020 census is fair and accurate nationally, right? Before joining the Leadership Conference and the Education Fund, Beth drove communication strategy and public narratives for major policy and electoral campaigns, and a lot of what we've done around the census has been about communicating its importance and its messaging. And these include successful campaigns to defeat the repeal of the Affordable Care Act in 2017, the 2017 electoral campaigns in Virginia, and the I Stand with Planned Parenthood campaign, defeating against efforts to defund the organization. She has also served on Capitol Hill in the office of Congresswoman Jan, I don't know how to pronounce her last name. Yes. And worked on I know how to pronounce this last name, and worked on the 2012 Obama for America campaign. Beth has a Bachelor's of Arts degree in Communications and Science in Civic Engagement from Northwestern University. And Beth brings a really unique perspective because, again, she works nationally on this issue and works really deep into states and with stakeholders and partners sort of around what census means in their localities. So we are very fortunate to have Beth join us today. Next, I'd like to introduce Laree Daniel Favors, who serves as the Interim Executive Director, and that's going to change soon, and General Counsel at the Center for Law and Social Justice. She is an activist and an attorney with a long-standing commitment to racial and social justice. Before graduating from NYU Law School as a Root Tilden Kern Public Interest Scholar, Ms. Daniel Favors co-founded Sankofa Community Empowerment, Inc., a nonprofit organization designed to empower racially disenfranchised community. She later co-founded Breaking the Cycle Consulting Services, which specializes in creating comprehensive professional development for educators, youth education programs, and family workshops designed to address the crisis in urban education through the use of culturally responsible teaching. Now more than ever with the census, we need that cultural lens as we deal with communities that have been disenfranchised. So she has been a leader in this space around the census for us. She is also a regular law and racial justice contributor on the Karen Hunter Show and the Sunday Civic Show on Sirius XM Urban View. So you can catch her at any time. And last but definitely not least is a veteran in this space. He's worked on several decennial census. This is Jeff Weiss, who is an adjunct professor and senior fellow at the New York Law School, where he directs the New York Census and Redistricting Institute and serves as an advisor for New York Counts 2020, which we're all members of. He's also a fellow at SUNY Buffalo Law School, now working on his 5th census cycle. Jeff led past census outreach efforts for the New York State Assembly and New York State Senate. During 2000 census cycle, he was counsel to President Bill Clinton's member of the U.S. Census Monitoring Board. He is a counsel in the New York State Assembly and co-editor of the National Conference of State Legislatures' recently published 2020 Redistricting Red Book, a comprehensive handbook on the census and redistricting process. Active for many years with the National Conference of State Legislatures, he is currently the staff chair of the NCSL's Redistricting and Elections Committee. Thank you all for joining us today to talk about what now? What happens? We've been doing this work for 2 years. We put our blood, sweat, and tears in this. We left nothing on the table, right? Now, what does this mean to the work that we do? But before we jump into that, if each of you can just tell us a little bit about the work that you've been doing and your organization leading up to and during the 2020 census. We'll start with Beth.
And thank you for the wonderful introduction. It is an honor and really a privilege to be here with everyone. The work that you have led and that ABNY has been doing is just astounding and incredible. And as someone who is holding and working on this 2020 census from a national perspective, it is incredible to see the amazing and nimble transition and flexibility to this really challenging reality that we're all living in terms of deploying census outreach, but also the forethought about how census, getting accurate and equitable census data is going to shape our ability to recover from this moment that we're in. So really, thank you to your leadership. As you mentioned, I am the Census Counts Campaign Director at the Leadership Conference Education Fund. I run a national campaign that is really focused on ensuring that the communities that have been historically left out of censuses decade after decade participate in the 2020 census. We do that through training, organizing, resources, and advocacy through a number of key action groups. So we work with national organizations that represent communities that have been historically missed in past censuses, like the National Urban League, NAACP, NALEO Educational Fund, Asian Americans Advancing Justice, another key partners through our National Get Out the Count coalition. Developing resources and developing translations and trainings to really support the overall infrastructure. We work with our state partners in all 50 states in the District of Columbia through our State Count Action Network. And we are really privileged to lift up the work of state and local elected officials across the country who are census champions, lifting up the importance of the census, the importance of an equitable census, and in some cases, supporting the work of advocacy to ensure that Congress is fulfilling their oversight role in preventing some of the census sabotage that we've been seeing going on this year. One of the things we have been doing, as was mentioned at the top, is as Melva, you mentioned, no one really expected this transition or a global pandemic to hit the census. And so we've definitely been doing a lot more of digital resources. We've deployed hotspots in locations across the country, working with food trucks and doing car caravans in locations where we're able to reach people, making sure that we're having our masks on and are ready in terms of how we're getting out the count, and really lifting up and using the power of coalition and the power of the civil rights movement and the civil rights community to get out the count and support a fair and accurate count.
Thank you for that, Beth. And, you know, talking about sort of transitioning from sort of the national perspective, you know, Loree, I'd really like to hear from you, you know, just again, continuing that sort of social justice theme. And although you have the expertise and knowledge of what's happening, you know, more broadly, I think you have a really unique ability and perspective diving deep into communities of affinity. So if you could just talk a little bit about the work that you've done all this time.
Absolutely. And I just want to echo the appreciation for being able to participate on such a fabulous panel and to have had the opportunity to work with people like you, Melva, who have been real leaders in this effort for the city of New York. And we at the Center for Law and Social Justice, as an institution, this is our fourth census cycle. And so we were fairly clear that a lot of the historical barriers that existed to communities of African descent participating in the census not only still exist, but we're going to be amplified largely because of the politicization of race and cultural and ethnic identity within the country, the general conversation across the country over the past several years. And so as a result of that, in 2017, we convened the New York City Black Leadership Advisory Coalition for Census 2020, which was intentionally designed to be a Pan-African coalition to address census. And we chose that approach because we recognize that a lot of times when we speak in terms of affinity groups or Black groups, we think almost by default in terms of Black Americans. And in the city of New York, we are phenomenally blessed to have representation from nearly every part of the Pan-African diaspora, be it African immigrants, Afro-Latinos, Afro-Caribbeans, African-Americans, Alabamians, folks from Miami, wherever you are from and you are part of the diaspora, you have representation here in the city of New York. And so we knew that having a singular conversation really was not going to be effective. And so we chose early on to frame census justice as a racial justice issue. And that coalition was designed to reach into organizations in all 5 boroughs and was really designed to elicit a conversation about what it means to be a person of African descent, regardless of your ethnic or nationality background and heritage. And so for us, it was really, it was phenomenal because we were able to be really, quite frankly, successful at creating a very nimble group of organizations and collaborators who were able to really be effective at absorbing a lot of the blows that we got from COVID and from the coronavirus. And so that was something that was phenomenally helpful for us because we recognized that we were already up against a lot of traditional barriers. We also decided to create or reconvene the Check Black campaign. And that was important for us because we envisioned the census as an entree point to overall civic engagement. And what that meant was that we weren't just going to be looking at census generally. We really wanted to think about how census was tied to all of the other areas of civic engagement that we support. And so just as an example, that campaign really did seek to explain to people, regardless of whether or not you identify personally with the racial category of Black, which is a very American thing, we had to explain to people how race in this country operates and how racial categories can be used to invoke various protections, be they civil rights protections, voting rights protections, anti-discrimination protections, so on and so forth. And these are not necessarily conversations that many of us are used to having, particularly because, as I often say, people of African descent in this country really only began having access to systems like the census and access to systems like the vote in the 1960s. So if you know someone who's 57 years or older, they're older than this nation's commitment to integration. And so there's a lot of missing experiential knowledge that communities of African descent do not have, simply because we were not afforded the opportunity to engage with these systems or structures for very long periods of time. And so that work continues. And even though we're technically going to be done with the census in September 30th, you know I'm an optimist, and I'm hoping that the courts and all the gods and goddesses will come through and we will be able to see an extension till October. We don't know, but we are working feverishly right now with our folks who are out in the field. We went from a very education-focused campaign. We had to shift to a completely digital campaign when coronavirus hit. But right now we have a team of folks, and my phone is buzzing right now from our team members who are out in the field, literally doing census signups on the spot at food distribution centers. Because unfortunately, while we had intended on going to the traditional institutions where many of us gather, those institutions are still dealing with the inability to do so because of the pandemic. And unfortunately, many of our community are in those lines, and they are waiting for food because of the economic hardships that they are now suffering. And so we have been able to partner and really engage with mutual aid organizations to ensure that we are where they are so that we can sign people up online. We send everyone away with wonderful swag that talks about how great the census was, and we deputize all of them to get their friends, family, and loved ones to fill it out. And so that work for us is ongoing, and we continue to be optimistic. We know we're on an uphill battle, but we also know that even though we're technically looking like we might beat our numbers, at least in parts of Brooklyn from 2010, even if we were to get 60%, we know that a 60% funding level for a school is not enough. Having a hospital funded at 60% is not enough. Having our infrastructure funded at 60% is not enough. And so we are all day, every day, continuing that work and making sure that we're doing what we can to get those numbers up and making sure that our community knows how relevant this issue is to their day-to-day life.
Yeah, and thank you for that and that explanation. You know, what I really appreciated about the campaign that the Center for Social Justice ran was 2 parts, right? It was sort of the coalition building between people of African descent across the city and sort of that through line, and organizations and members of the coalition sort of working together around census outreach. And then also the exploration of the deep history and how sort of, you know, historical factors affect certain populations' ability to respond to the census. And that was incredibly helpful for me in creating a lens as I do the work across cultures and across race, that, you know, there's really historical reference, and you taught me that. So thank you for that. Sure. And next I'd like to introduce Jeff Weiss, our veteran in this. Jeff, could you tell us a little bit about the many hats that you have worn during this decennial census and the work that you continue to do around the census?
Well, Melba, thank you very much. And it's a pleasure to join my colleagues, Beth and Laurie, on this panel today. And good to hear from James Patchett, too. This is my 5th census cycle. I always don't want to admit that, but this is the most active census. When I first started, I'll say it was the 1980 census, people didn't really, there were no such things as census outreach efforts. They were unheard of. The Census Bureau ran a program, it counted people, and that was it. James mentioned in his presentation that New York needs all the members of Congress we can possibly get through a good count. Well, in 1980, after the census, New York lost 5 congressional districts. That hurts. When we look at New York having 45 members of Congress during World War II, we're now down to 27, the same number the state had in the 1820s. So every person counts, and every person counts across the state. So I got active again for this cycle, working with the New York Immigration Coalition and creating New York Counts 2020, a statewide outreach and organizing coalition of over 200 organizations. While most of our groups are New York City based, we've covered the entire state, and I focused a lot of my effort at reaching out to upstate counties, county executives, foundations, good government groups, civic associations, to make sure that every county had an active, robust outreach operation. Because when we look at the way the numbers fall and the representation, counting somebody in Brooklyn is just as important as counting somebody up in the Catskills or in Buffalo, because we sink or swim as a state in terms of congressional numbers, our strength in Washington. So I've been going around the state, Zoom since March, training, educating, analyzing, getting into the weeds to help people understand the importance of the census, the schedule as to what's going on, how it all comes together, and trying now to make them think outside the envelope. Money is run dry from the city and the state. Money was put into the census for the first time by New York City, and New York State went from $2 million in 2010 to $15 million spent, not as much as we thought we should see from the state, but given the pandemic, New York State finally put in some funds about a month ago to go to counties and community-based organizations. So I've been working with them, trying to make sure they get the job done at the community level, and then to think outside the envelope. What haven't you done yet? Just today we thought, well, we're hearing that police officers haven't responded to the census. So we'll reach out to the police unions, to the commissioners, county executives, make sure the cops, the firemen, the sanitation workers are all counted. People we haven't been looking at counting until recently, but we've discovered aren't responding themselves. So it's all a zero-sum game, and New York State has to make sure that everyone counts, and whether we continue through September 30th or the end of October, that's up to the courts and Congress now. Every person counts. We say 10 minutes, 10 questions, 10 years, now more than ever.
Thank you for that, Jeff. And again, I think sort of understanding sort of the history, and you always bring sort of the technical piece to the process, which I also really appreciate because of your extensive history, has been able to help us move in a more strategic way and thoughtful way, so that we're not reinventing the wheel, and your historical sort of knowledge around that has been really helpful and been the key in that. So thank you for that. So before I start my questions, I want to remind the audience, if you have questions for the panelists, please use the Q&A function in Zoom so that we could address your questions to these 3 experts. So thank you for giving a great description of what you guys have been doing over the last 2 years in communities, on the ground, right? But what does that mean, right? How do we build on this year's census outreach to support continued advocacy, right? Because a lot of these issues will persist past this decennial census count, and the work that you do outside of the census. Talk to us a little bit about what this means going forward. I'll start with Laurie.
Sure. I think that's a really important question, particularly for our community, our communities of African descent, because, as I mentioned, our exposure to these systems is so very fresh. It's so very new. These are not systems that we created. And so being allowed to participate in them, engage in them, is something that is, a beautiful thing, but it means that we are behind by a lot. And behind particularly as it pertains to, again, that experiential knowledge. Not just what does it mean to fill out a census, but what does it mean to fill out a census and to vote, and to see the vote as part of maybe a 10 to 15 step process that goes from identifying an issue in the community to creating and implementing a solution. And so one of the things that we've decided to do is that coalition that I mentioned earlier, the Nick Black Coalition, we are continuing to activate that work. In fact, we have a meeting this afternoon. We are continuing to build that coalition as it pertains to seeing that census as really a jumping off point. So next up for us is obviously the elections that are coming up, and educating voters, not just about what the vote is, but how they can actually execute the vote. And then in New York City, we have ranked choice voting coming up. And while many of us are scratching our heads trying to figure out what that is, many people within communities of African descent are in the very beginning processes of learning how that system can be used to really use in a more sophisticated way to really bring about the types of change that we need. And so we're going to be building on that coalition and keeping that coalition together for civic engagement purposes. So that means partnering with organizations like the Brooklyn NAACP for our ranked choice voting education campaign. It means partnering with organizations like Ife Tayo and other organizations that we were connected to as a part of the census process, to ensure that not just are we excelling in the arts and excelling in STEM, but we're able to see how those things are connected to civic engagement and why civic engagement is so vitally necessary for those other elements of our community to flourish. When we think about the history, you mentioned, I was an Africana studies major, so history and how history impacts where we are today is something that's so important to me. There is just a desperate need for massive civic engagement education campaigns for communities that have been largely excluded from the body politic. And so at CLSJ, that's one of the initiatives that we are launching, is building on that coalition, maintaining that coalition, so that we can not only have that as a basis, but we can build on that further as it pertains to ensuring that our communities are properly educated. And then I just think it's also, I would be remiss if I did not say that one of the other issues that we're looking to really address is how did we do as a census coalition? We, back in 2010, we have brilliant folks like Jeff, like Esmeralda, the founder of the Center for Law and Social Justice, who are really walking census Bibles, redistricting Bibles, and they have all of this phenomenal information. And so we want to take not just what we learned from them, but we want to be analytical and assess how we did as a coalition, and can we create a blueprint for the next go round. We said early in the census world that we're thinking about 2020, while other folks are already planning for 2030 and 2040. And so part of our census work includes a look back and an evaluation as to what worked, what didn't, what things should we can think about expanding upon for the next time around, what things should we perhaps leave to the side. But we want to create a blueprint that can live on the websites of every single one of the organizations that was a part of our coalition, that can be really instructive and helpful, and as it pertains to not just creating and maintaining civic engagement coalitions, but what do we do to be strategic so that by 2030, we have a well-oiled machine and we're not reinventing the wheel. And we get the benefit of having the influence of folks like an Esmeralda Simmons, like a Jeff Weiss, that we can reduce to paper and produce a document that people will be able to use, hopefully for time going forward. So it's both a planning for future civic engagement and a look back to see what we learned and how we take those lessons to make us all better.
I love that. I love that sort of documentation piece of sort of what works, what doesn't, sort of the perspective and approach from leaders in this space. Thank you for doing that. I think that's amazing. And sometimes, we get so wrapped up in our day-to-day and what's happening right in front of us, and we need to, right? Because there are, working in the communities that we work in, there are immediate problems that we need to address before we can address more global things. But I think sometimes there's also some best practices and useful information that that can come from sort of a more national response. So I turn over to you, Beth. If you could talk a little bit about sort of what this means for the work that you plan to do and the Leadership Conference. I mean, again, you know, the Leadership Conference has been such a leader around these issues, and very interested to hear sort of what the next step is.
Absolutely. And I think what Lori said about the fact that we need to document the work that has happened, the connections that were made, the relationships that have been built, and the knowledge that has been shared across communities, I think is so critically important. In many ways, this census is very unique. And I think many of us in the census world would say, hopefully no other census is like this, but there's also a lot of learning that we've done, a lot of muscles that we've flexed that are new, whether it's figuring out new ways to do digital outreach, building new partnerships. We've been working with a lot of communities, a lot of rural communities in the South, but also in upstate New York, that are partnering with social service providers, folks who are providing disaster relief, or other folks that might be new to the civic engagement space. And now that they have built those relationships, are finding other areas of shared connection and shared ways to partner on future engagements, whether it's redistricting or whether it is finding new avenues and ways to ensure that communities that have been for far too long excluded from conversations about our democracy and about from participating in the systems that were not built by us, but that do shape our communities. There are now kind of avenues, relationships, and muscles that have been built that can be used to ensure that we're building a more equitable society for the long term, and particularly as we're in this moment of rebuilding and investment in the communities that need to be supported and really held in this moment of upheaval and of real trauma. The Leadership Conference Education Fund, which holds the Census Counts campaign, will kind of continue to work on building public will for the laws and policies that shape the 2020 census, and kind of whatever the next step is. We do have concerns about the accuracy and the completeness of the census data, given the truncated timeline. Work around that will continue. But I think it's also important that we make plans and plan around our next steps in terms of how we're utilizing this data. The Leadership Conference and our coalition use census data in a number of ways. We'll talk about apportionment and redistricting in a second, but also it's an important tool for change, whether it's advocating for legislation, fighting and enforcing voting rights, fighting and enforcing civil rights and voting in housing and education as well. And we'll continue to do that work. And building upon the infrastructure and the work that many across the country have done. I think just kind of a final thought on this is when we initiated this outreach and started kind of having conversations, Melva, I think we talked for the first time like 2 years ago at this point, and the intention at that point, you know, the Leadership Conference and many of our partners worked on outreach efforts in the 2010 census and before. But this was different. We knew that there were systems at play that were trying to suppress voices of communities around the country. We knew that there were going to be unique challenges. We didn't know this one, but we knew it was going to be hard. And so we built this infrastructure, and I think the largest outreach effort to support census engagement and coordination that has ever been built. And it was necessary in this moment. We're faced with unprecedented challenges, and we rose with unprecedented infrastructure. And so and the next iteration of that, I think, is really going to be informed by how was that helpful? How was maybe good intentions not as helpful? And shaping that and continuing those conversations with our state partners like ABNY and with folks across the country, but making sure that the next steps and the recommendations are led by the communities that really stepped up and have been leading on the front lines is going to be really important as we tell the story of what happened in the 2020 census and build recommendations for the long term.
Yeah, and you know, thinking about the long term, and you sort of brought this up, and I'm going to ask Jeff to answer this. You know, you mentioned sort of about, again, what comes next, the reapportionment and the redistricting process. So Jeff, I'm just going to ask you to jump right in. If you can tell us how the 2021-2022 state reapportionment and redistricting process will work, and also talk a little bit about how the New York City Council will be redistricted from 2023 elections.
Okay, I'll try to do this in about 1 minute plus from a 30,000 foot view. Basically, the president will receive the census state population totals by December 31st of this year. There is an effort, in addition to stretching the census counting period from September to the end of October, an effort to extend the reapportionment deadline of December 31st to April 1st of next year to give the Census Bureau adequate time to analyze and crunch the data. But once we get the population totals, whether it's in December or April, we'll know how many congressional districts each state is entitled to. New York now has 27 districts. The projections based on 50 state population growth and changes is that New York will likely lose 1 congressional district, hopefully not 2 with a bad undercount or a flawed census. And then we have a quiet period, so to speak, where the Census Bureau will complete tabulating the data and then send the information to the states. By next spring or summer, the New York State will receive the detailed block-by-block community data by which it will redistrict or redraw the lines for the Congress, the State Senate, and State Assembly. For the first time in history, New York will not be redistricted by the state legislature alone through a simple act of the legislature that the governor approves, but will be using a new commission that the voters approved by constitutional amendment in 2014. And this commission, 10 members, mostly appointed by the legislative leaders, but outside the legislature, will develop plans for the Congress, the Assembly, the Senate, and will have until about January 1st, 2022 to submit a plan for all 3 bodies, Congress, the Senate, and Assembly, to the state legislature for approval. And then if it's approved, to the governor for his signature. The legislature could reject that plan and ask the commission to submit a second plan by mid-January, and then go to the governor for approval. And if the second plan is rejected, then the legislature can draw basically whatever plan it wants. So we have a different schedule there. Also, I'll note that the voters may be asked next year to vote on yet one more state constitutional amendment, one that will tighten the criteria and change the process a little bit, plus address the need to complete redistricting of the legislature and Congress in time for the spring 2022 primary, because the 2014 amendment looked at having a fall primary, as New York usually had, but last year, as we all know, the primary was moved from September to June. So there are just some adjustment dates that the legislature is dealing with, and voters may be asked to approve next year. And then once we have new state congressional and state legislative lines in place, voters will be asked to elect new legislators based on those new district lines in November 2022. So the districts we have now, 150 Assembly, 63 Senate, right now 27 congressional districts, all get redrawn based on the census population. By 2023, the New York City Council has to redraw its lines for 51 council districts. And similar to what the state requires, the city charter creates or mandates a commission that will redraw the city council lines, and that has to be completed by the end of 2022 so that candidates can begin running for office and filing in 2023. Between the lines, there are criteria, public hearings, processes, lots of T's to cross and I's to dot. Now, you don't just get the data and draw districts. You've got to go through an entire process, which the public should get involved in through public hearings, public participation, I'll be working on a major educational outreach campaign. I'm doing more webinars on this already. So it's the census is step one. Voting is step two. The whole civic engagement for this November's elections and documenting how the census went. But it all really wraps up. And I say wraps up. There's never an end date to this anymore. By 2022 for the state and 2023 for the city.
Thank you. That was a lot. And if you can just, I'm sure there are folks who missed part of that process, and it's important for folks to understand. If you can just let us know where we can find more information on that.
Actually, I will make available a primer I've done on the current New York State process. Of course, it's subject to amendment next year, but I do have a 3 or 4 page document that will walk through each step of this process and explain it, plus adding the criteria, public hearings, and other aspects of the process. I will send it on, Melva, to you, which you can contribute to all the viewers today.
Absolutely. And if you're interested, if you could just put that in a Q&A and with your email address, and we'll get that document to you. For those who have to jump off, I want to thank you. We do want to open it up to Q&A because, again, we had a lot of great information on this webinar, and we have some experts that we don't want to let go without asking them some questions. So I'd like to actually turn it over to my colleague, Ayofemi Kirby, who runs our pop-up agency, who has been working with many of our community-based organizations throughout New York City, providing assistance and technical support around messaging and communication strategies, and she will handle the Q&A.
Thank you, Melva, and thank you, everyone. That was such a great conversation. And also thank everyone for their hard work this year. I know with all the changes and the pivoting, everyone has had to be super creative, so thank you for that as well. Please do put your questions in the Q&A. I'll start with this one. I love the concept of creating a blueprint for 2030. Are there ways for all the different organizations to work together? And I know Melva may have some thoughts about that too, but I will turn it over to you all.
Loree, I know you have to jump, but if you
That is perfect. This is perfect. Yes. So if you are interested in finding out more about how future collaborations can work, at least as it pertains to this work that Center for Law and Social Justice is engaged in, just shoot us an email, info@clsj.org. That's info@clsj.org. I'm happy to make sure that you're connected to the work that we're doing. I believe I recognize the name of the person who asked that question, and we've done some work together, so it's exciting to see that there's a willingness and a desire to continue collaborating. So please do send us an email, let us know that you're interested in some of the future collaborative work, and we're happy to get you involved. Unfortunately, I do have to go, but I just want to express my sincere thanks and appreciation for being able to be a part of this conversation.
Thank you. Okay. And I know a couple folks asked if this information will be made available, the webinar and the contact information for every organization after the webinar, and we will send that out with a follow-up email. And all of our webinars are available at abnycensus2020.org/webinar. So this one will be posted within probably about 48 hours or by Monday. Another question, and I think this is more technical. I know there's like complexities around the answer to this, but how possible is it that the date for the census completion will be extended again to October 31st? Is that an option? Is it likely? What do you guys think?
I could.
Beth was right. Beth was
Yeah, so it's a good question and very timely given the developments over the weekend. So as folks know, there are lots of lawsuits around the 2020 census. About 9 lawsuits were filed, including a New York lawsuit after Trump introduced a memorandum excluding undocumented immigrants from the apportionment totals that would be reported to the White House and to Congress for the purposes of apportionment. But then there were also 3 additional lawsuits filed or other lawsuits expanded to challenge the extension or the shortening of the census timeline from what the Census Bureau career and expert staff proposed of a October 31 timeline of ending data collection, and also extending the statutory reporting deadline so they have time to process the data to April and July, to compacting that time. And what we've all seen is that the timeline has been shortened to end at the end of September, and the Census Bureau's original 5 months that they would have had to process and really go through the data is truncated to 3 months, and they have to report the data for the purposes of apportionment by December. This weekend, one of those lawsuits, one led by the Lawyers Committee, the National Urban League, Brennan Center, among others, Baji as well, won a temporary restraining order, which instructed the Census Bureau to stop winding down operations until a preliminary injunction hearing can take place on September 17th. That does not change the end date. But what it does do is it prevents the Census Bureau from laying off enumerators in areas where they may be over 85% response rates. Their previous plan had been, once they got to 85%, to start winding down staff or to start their closeout operations. And it also stops them from kind of proceeding with that closeout process. On September 17th, after that preliminary injunction hearing, we'll know whether that lawsuit is successful in kind of extending the timeline. At the same time, we are also calling on Congress to extend the statutory deadlines for apportionment and redistricting, and to extend that data collection period, the enumeration period, to October 31. At this point, there is not a legislative vehicle. The Speaker Pelosi has made clear that the continuing resolution will be clean, won't include riders like this, and it's unclear in terms of timeline on a COVID relief package. So it is uncertain. From our perspective at the Census Counts campaign, we're focused fully on how are we leaving everything on the field for a potential end on September 30th, and lifting up the urgency that folks respond as soon as possible right now. And yet we are planning that there is a possibility that folks may have some additional time to respond if the legal challenges are successful or if things shift in Congress. So I know that it's a complicated landscape. I will say, I think that the urgency right now is to encourage folks to respond as soon as possible, and knowing that there is just additional uncertainty that is layered on top of the census crisis that we're all living within, that there is a possibility, and there certainly is a window, that it does get extended, but we won't know until mid-month. It's also going to be really important that those statutory deadlines get extended so that the Census Bureau has the time if we win those lawsuits too.
Awesome. Thank you for that, Beth. I don't know if Jeff or Melva, you have any follow-up to Beth's explanation?
I would agree with Beth and just add that it's imperative that Congress both extend the census counting period and the deadline by which the data is reported for congressional reapportionment, so that the data is properly analyzed. Given that this is such a fast-moving topic right now, with so many courts hearing it, it's hard to know day to day what will happen. But right now, the temporary restraining order that the California judge has issued does prevent the Bureau from closing down operations. My own sense is that these challenges are going to succeed at the trial court level, but eventually we'll get on a fast track to the U.S. Supreme Court, where it's anyone's guess on a 5-4 court that's usually divided where it might end up. And hopefully Congress will also address this through a legislative extension, but the president also has to approve that. So it's all going to be part of a very fast-moving process that we only have about a month and a half to deal with.
And Beth, I know you have to jump as well. Ifemi, do we have any final questions?
We do have a couple.
I could say in that an extra.
Awesome, thanks, Jeff. What effects do you see redistricting possibly having in New York? Before Beth, you hop off, and Jeff, yeah.
I guess I could answer that. That has a major impact, well, reapportionment will have an impact because reapportionment is simply the allocation of congressional districts among the 50 states. Whether New York will have 27 or 26 districts, that's reapportionment. And if we lose a district, it means that one district has to go, that one member has got to face another member in a merged district. We've lost 5 districts in 80, 3 districts in 90 and 2000, and 2 districts after 2010. So that has a major impact on New York State. In terms of redistricting, we're still going to have 150 assembly districts and 63 Senate districts, and in New York City, 51 council districts, but the lines will shift based on the census numbers. So if there's an area that reports a low population number because of an undercount, that people are missed, those people have to be accounted for. Well, they're not accounted for. Those districts will grow because they need more population. So if you have a district now of 50,000 people, but it reports in after the census at 45,000 people, the districts have to change. All of them have to change. So redistricting has an impact everywhere in the state, across the board.
Definitely. Thank you for that, Jeff. And then I think our final question, if you do have any questions, any additional ones, please put them in the Q&A box. But just asking about COVID-19 and our field representatives, how has it affected their ability to conduct in-person outreach? Will there be any additional changes? What do you guys think about the environment and where we'll end up in in-person outreach with our enumerators?
I'll give it a quick answer. It's a challenge. Before I joined this webinar, I was watching the U.S. House of Representatives Census Oversight hearing, where one of the witnesses talked about how in some parts of the country, enumerators are not knocking on doors, they're simply leaving a piece of paper outside. In New York City, we know that there's a shortage of people staying with the Census Bureau. A friend of mine who's been working as an enumerator in Manhattan told me that people were, quitting more than they were, staying on the job. So that's a big challenge. And we're hoping that the Bureau will have enough people to pull through. Newsday reports today that enumerators based in Queens are being asked to go to Suffolk County to count people there. I do hope they're going to count people in Brooklyn, where the need is the greatest in New York City.
Yeah, thank you, Jeff. And from the other side of that, we have individuals who are reluctant to open the door without COVID-19, right? Open the door for strangers. And then having this global pandemic on top of it makes it that much more difficult for enumerators who are on the job and willing to sort of go door to door to get to the people who need to be counted. So it definitely has presented a challenge. I will say the Census Bureau has really stepped up in their mobile questionnaire assistance teams, in their community teams out there to encourage self-response. Even the community-based organizations on the ground saying, listen, if you don't want enumerators to knock on your door, or if you missed the enumerator, there are other opportunities for you to self-respond, and really pushing that message. But COVID-19 has absolutely had an effect on the enumerators' ability to do their job.
And that looks like that is our final question. There are lots of requests for your presentation, Jeff, so we'll have to follow up with that. But thank you again, everyone. I placed the URL where you can find this recording and our previous webinar recordings in the chat box. It's abnycensus2020.org/webinars. And you can also reach us at Census 2020 at abnycensus2020.org. Thank you, guys, and I'll turn it back over to Melva to end the conversation.
Thank you. I want to thank all of the panelists, and I also just want to give a special thank you to Femi Kirby, because, at the beginning of this process of helping community-based organizations, we knew sort of instructional workshops and classes were going to be important, but once COVID-19 hit, she quickly sort of transferred sort of all of the knowledge and expectations around that into a virtual format. And she has really been consistent in keeping the beat going throughout this period with a number of different webinars. And if you look on our website, you'll see all of the really helpful tools that were put together to help not only the stakeholders on the ground doing census outreach, but the general public. And that was really all IOFEMI. So thank you, IOFEMI, for putting together such a great group of trainings through webinar for our census community.
Thank you, Melva.
And
it means a lot.
Sad to say, this one wraps up our series, but we thought it was really important to talk a little bit about now what happens, right? You've gained all these skills and these relationships, and now we'll have this product, which is census data and funding from census data. What do we do with it, and what do we do to make it better? Again, please check out the recording of this webinar on our website. If you have additional questions about anything that was mentioned today, you can contact us at the email address that IOFEMI mentioned. And yeah, let's keep it going, right? The census is not over. We will finish strong. We will leave nothing on the table. We will work to get our response rates up and have a better count and more fair and accurate for our city, our state, and for our nation. So thank you, guys. Thanks for joining us this afternoon. Thanks, Jeff.
Okay. Thank you all.